Shalom and welcome to this, our ninth edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. The topic for this session is going to be Upon This Rock. This is going to be one of the actually last and most important teachings that Jesus did with his disciples. The whole idea of disciples and a rabbi, I'd like to look at that to start off today. Disciples, in Hebrew, they were called Talmudim, which literally means students. And an expression that was so very important back in that world, study that leads to obedience is the highest form of worship. So the goal of a disciple, a Talmudim, was to live with a rabbi, to watch everything he does so that you could be like your rabbi. And of course, Jesus said something that would confirm that idea: whoever has my commands and obeys them, he is the one who loves me. The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Another statement of Jesus confirming this whole idea. Now, what causes someone to want to follow a particular rabbi? What they would do is they would watch the lives of his disciples. And if they would see something in their lives that really impressed them, they thought, wow, who's your rabbi? I would like to meet him. I would like to follow him. Now, it's kind of a convicting idea if we think about that, because as Christians, the same idea would be true today. Do other people, when they see us, do they want to follow Jesus? So when a young man decided he wanted to follow a particular rabbi, he would come up to the rabbi and mention he would love to become his disciple. Now, this was not an easy process, because that young man, the Talmud, the disciple, would have to answer questions from the rabbi. And the rabbi would check his knowledge of the Bible. And the types of questions he would ask would be very, very, very complicated. So most of them were rejected because the level of knowledge, even at the beginning stages, was really something. Now, most of the disciples during that time period were young. Between the ages of 16 and 22 was pretty much normal. So were Jesus' disciples that young? Well, yeah, we have a really big clue in the scriptures that indicate that they were pretty much according to the norm. Going back to this verse from Exodus, each one who crosses over, give a half shekel. Those 20 years old or more. This is going to be called the temple tax. Now, it relates to this incident right here, and also in terms of determining ages of the disciples. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. Now notice, they're all there. Jesus and all his disciples are here when this question is asked. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of earth collect duties and taxes? From their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Not the rest of the disciples, for my tax and yours. So a 4 drachma coin would be equal to 1 shekel. And the temple tax was 1/2 of a shekel. So clearly that's enough for only 2, Jesus and Peter. So what does that mean? That means only Jesus and Peter were 20 years old or older. And that's it. The rest of them were teenagers. So that's kind of hard for us to think about, because we normally think of the disciples as being older than that, but they weren't. They were young, pretty much like high school kids, which makes it even more amazing what happened here. Now, an important teaching method of the rabbis is if you speak to the heart, the head will come. If you speak to the head, the heart may never come. So we've heard the expression, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And that's why the rabbis spoke in terms of trees and flowers and roads and wheat and salt, light and birds and so forth, because they taught, as I've mentioned before, this whole idea of pictures. And that's really how we're wired too, I think. A very important expression back in those days was be covered in the dust of your rabbi, which meant follow your rabbi so close across the dusty roads of Israel, which most of them were, that you become dusty, that you become getting literally dust from his sandals. And the other part of that would be, and drink in his words as if you were dying of thirst. So that kind of ambition and desire to follow the rabbi, to be like the rabbi, to not miss a word, to hear everything he has to say. Rabbis often did not tell their disciples where they're going to go. They had to trust him. Rabbis taught many of their lessons at specific locations for very specific reasons, and that is a very important idea in terms of what we're going to look at today. Jesus is going to just take his disciples to a very significant place to teach a huge lesson. So we're going to join Jesus and his disciples on one of his last teachings. So I'm kind of going to the end of his teachings because this is so important. I wanted to kind of overlay everything else, almost like a graduation ceremony, preparing them for what was to come. So here we go. The Sea of Galilee is at the bottom right. I think you can see down there. We're going to start down there in Capernaum, and we're going to go this way. So Jesus is going to take his disciples, his Talmudim, on a 27-mile trip is how long that is. So there they go. And you can see, according to the map, they're going to go up to the base of this big tall mountain called Mount Hermon. Today, modern-day Lebanon would be to the left and Syria to the right. And that area just to the right is called the Golan Heights. And they would have traveled up near the Jordan River, going along that direction. And as they kept walking, sometimes the rabbis would teach along the way, and sometimes they'd just walk right to the destination in total silence. But I am certain, as they got closer and closer to that destination, and you'll see why in a minute, they're asking a question. What's going on here? Where's he taking us? Why way up here? Now, in the distance, you can see the white snow-capped Mount Hermon today, and you can see that valley. That's called the Hula Valley. The Jordan River up here is very fast. I think I mentioned this before. It means the Jordan is Yarden in Hebrew, which means descender. It's very quick up here, coming down the slopes. Now, Jesus might have taught this lesson up here because this area is a massive concentration of birds migrating between Africa and Asia and Europe. Maybe this lesson, if he would have seen some of these birds, because this really is quite the area of birds flying between those continents. Look at the birds of the air. Do they not sow or reap or store away in barns? And yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Okay, so I would quite sure he probably taught lessons like that along the way. We don't know for sure. But let's get to the location up here. And it's right at the base of this Mount Hermon, as I mentioned. And Mount Hermon is a big ridge right up here. It's about 9,300 feet. Soon after this event we're going to talk about right now, was the Transfiguration. It's very possible that's where the Transfiguration was, right up there on top of Mount Hermon. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the tribe that lived in that area during these times, the tribe of Dan. Now, if you'll notice on this map, Dan, the lower Dan, was where they originally were. And the insert picture is kind of a picture of what it looks like from the area of their main cities, looking out towards the seacoast. And out towards the seacoast were the Philistines. And so the tribe of Dan had a lot of interactions with the Philistines. Of course, Samson was a Danite. And a lot of them they got really tired of, and they thought, I wonder if there's a better place to live. So they started looking way north at a place up there, as you can see the other circle. And found out, wow, does that place ever look good? Away from the Philistines and some very beautiful land. So they decided to move up here. They conquered this. There was a town there called Laish at the time, and they conquered it. And that's where they settled. So how was that area different? What was this big lure for the tribe of Dan up here? Now, there are two main cities up here in the New Testament time period. Of Old Testament, there was a town called Dan, originally called Laish. And in the New Testament, actually, is when it become the city to the right of it is called Caesarea Philippi, which is going to be the focus for today. So there's two main areas up there, two main cities that were part of it. So how is this different? What's different about it? Well, most of Israel looked like this. And in the north, it looked like this. Lush, water, just beautiful. Rivers all over the place. Just like Garden of Eden type looking. So the tribe of Dan were just like, wow, this is great. They loved it up there. But the problem is, in that ancient world, wherever these really lush areas of water and springs and that kind of thing is usually the places of the most idolatry. And that definitely was true up here. That's where the gods, the ancients believed, lived, because they produced this richness, this fertility and all that water that was brought forth life. And this is the main town of Dan right here today, in the ruins of what's called the high place. You can see the arrow pointing down to it. And before that is where the altar was. Now, this is definitely an indication that the tribe of Dan had serious problems. The king Jeroboam, after the kingdom split, he's the one that was the head of the northern kingdoms, and Rehoboam the southern kingdoms. He had built two golden calves, one here and one at a town called Bethel. And so there was idolatry that began to be practiced by the Israelites. Initially, Jeroboam thought we can kind of blend the two together. Well, that did not work out. The idea of worshiping these golden calves and the gods of the ancients, and also the God of Israel, but that didn't go very far because that simply was a disaster. It was a disaster because even as Jeroboam told the people, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. So you can see he's actually gone completely over. We're going to worship these gods at this point. And the result of that was absolutely disastrous. Dan was the first tribe taken into captivity. So Dan is the area to the left I just mentioned, because this whole area was a tribe of Dan. And right here, now that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to look at today. That's called Caesarea Philippi, actually named that just before the New Testament time period. And it's named after these two guys, Caesar Augustus and Herod Philip. Herod Philip was one of the sons of Herod the Great. And in this, when Herod the Great died, his sons kind of divided up the kingdom. This part of it, way in the north, was ruled by Herod Philip. And he's going to name this town after himself and after the Caesars, Caesarea Philippi. So you can see right there, just to the right of Dan. Okay? Now, here's what it looks like. It's a cave at the center of it. The town itself was just beneath the cave, right by the trees, that area. But the cave was kind of like the heart of it. And that cave is to the right of it. You can see, it's a little hard to determine what those are, but we'll look at them much closer in just a second here. But at that time period, there's a huge spring going to be coming right out of that cave. And it isn't anymore, because in 1837, a massive earthquake, remember this is an earthquake-prone area, diverted the water supply, and you can see it's coming out below the cave at this point. So here's a little video of that area.
In the parking lot are excavated ruins that have revealed a small part of the first-century city, Caesarea Philippi, so named to differentiate it from Caesarea on the coast. The cave was believed by many Gentiles to be the entrance to Hades. A copious spring, one of the sources of the Jordan River, came from the cave. However, the water now originates outside and below the cave's opening. To the right of the cave are ruins of a limestone sanctuary to Pan. Statues to Pan adorn the niches on each side of the opening. Near here, Peter proclaimed Jesus was the Messiah.
In Old Testament days, the gods or worship were Baal and Asherah. And I mentioned that the areas where the water flowed, the springs, the fertility gods were worshipped. So these are the two, the male and female gods of the Old Testament days. Now, the fertility cults, which they represented, the idea is this: at the end of each rainy season, the god and his mistress went down into Hades and they would have sexual relations. And out of these would come fertility. So the idea here is into that into that cave, which was filled with water, with springs, where that fertility came out of. So they practiced these very pagan fertility rites right here by this cave. Now, Baal, in the Israelite time period, was an important god, of course, of the Canaanites, and unfortunately, some of the Israelites kind of copied him. And Asherah, the female goddess, in Babylon was actually known as Ishtar. She went by many different names, and she could change man into a woman or a woman into a man. So that whole idea is extremely ancient. That was the idea of that goddess, that she could do this. Many believed that this cave was the source of the mythical river Styx, the entrance to the underworld, no bottom to it. So they would drop sacrifices into this cave, thinking it's going to reach this mythical river and drop and go to the gods, bringing their wishes to come true. Now, the Bible says, God said, "You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth, or beneath, or in the waters below." So clearly this is a violation. So if we carry this up more to the time period where we're at now, in 200 BC, this area became the world center of a worship of a Greek fertility god named Pan, the shepherd god, who was pictured on the right, half man, half goat. You can see Pan riding on a goat on the right. A very pagan practice, and it was done right here. So that was the key idolatry going on at this time period. Jesus and his young disciples must have witnessed many pagan rituals being practiced. Now, they had to wonder what in the world, the disciples had to wonder, why in the world, Rabbi, did you take us here? Because in front of them were very many ritualistic sacrifices, extremely pagan. On the left, this is a diagram of what it looked like, was a temple built over the cave, over the springs that were bubbling out to Augustus, the Augustus temple. In the middle was the temple to Pan, and then on the right was the goat temple. So all this is like right in front of them. And they had to be wondering why here. This is a view of it today, the ruins, looking from where the cave is, looking back towards the other idolatry platforms up there. These little niches are areas where some other gods were placed to honor them. You can see more here. They're all over this rocky cliff right here. Now this way we're looking back towards the cave again, of the ruins of today. Now the rabbis called it the gates of Hades because it was so pagan. When the Messiah returns, they said, the gates of Hades are going to collapse. It's that bad. So why did Rabbi Jesus bring his young disciples to a place like this? What do he want to teach them? What's going on? What's the point of this? When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Now, this is a different image of today's Jesus. Much of today's culture has watered down Jesus and his teachings to the image that they desire him to be. So, for example, comparing him to John the Baptist. Of course, John the Baptist was extremely bold. Remember him saying to the Pharisees and the temple authorities coming to listen to him, "You brood of vipers, how can you, who are evil, say anything good?" And of course, all the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Elijah were extremely bold, calling the people back to God. They had no problem doing that, and they many times paid a great sacrifice for doing so. So comparing Jesus to the prophets is interesting. Now, to bring that to today, society could kind of look at Christians and kind of maybe ask the question, you're a Christian, you follow Jesus, so you should be accepting of all beliefs, all lifestyles. You should not speak up. You should just kind of lay back and it's all fine. Is that the idea? Well, Jesus is all-inclusive in his offer of repentance. He was the most compassionate, truthful, selfless person to ever walk the earth. Because that's true, there was a lot more to his message. And the part of his message that is left off in today's culture quite often, increasingly more so today for sure, is this idea of judgment, or the idea of placing restrictions, having guidelines, and to be compared a parent loving a child. If a parent loves their child, do they let their child just do whatever they want? Clearly not, because the parent understands the danger that the child could get into. So they set guidelines, they set rules, and that would be a major part of it. This incident of Jesus entering the temple area began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Isn't it written, my house should be a house of prayer for all nations?" So what's going on here is they were doing their exchanges, their business, in the area of the Gentile courts. You can see this diagram or this model of the temple. The temple itself in the center, that's where the Israelites could go. The Gentiles could only go in the outer courts. And apparently they were crowding out the Gentiles. And Jesus said, "My house should be a house of prayer for all nations." And he was really upset by this. By saying, "You have made it a den of robbers," he's quoting Jeremiah. So what was going on here is these elite leaders, these temple authorities, had no respect for the common people. They were doing currency exchanges that were extremely expensive. People had to come in with their currencies and exchange them for the temple currency. And they were making all kinds of money on that. People would bring sacrifices like a sacrificial lamb during Passover, and they would not accept them most of the time and say you would have to buy one of these at a very high price. So that's what he meant by a den of robbers. There's so much going on here. In addition to that, most of the temple authorities were not even legitimate. They were bought out political positions. So there was a lot of corruption going on here. Now, other examples would be among the Jewish leaders, Jesus called them hypocrites many times. He even said, "You are of your father, the devil." He called the leaders of false shepherds, the blind guides. And in Revelation, Jesus condemns Thyatira's sin of tolerance. They were tolerating the false prophet Jezebel. That was a church in that area. So is it easy to follow Jesus? Well, he said his message would cause division. Families would be divided against each other because of him. He said, "Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." Jesus' instructions for our approach, I think this is important, kind of a perspective, and this is not easy to do either. "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." And that's interesting approach on how to handle things, for us to be very wise and yet have this calmer demeanor about loving our brother. So it's kind of like this balance that has to stay together that oftentimes is very, very difficult. So back to the key question. Who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets," as I mentioned here. And we looked at this image of Jesus by this response, how this is different than what the culture a lot of times says today. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." All right. Now, this is a key phrase here, the Son of the living God. This was a revelation that Peter was giving here that was new, that was not common before, something very different. The common belief was that Jesus was the son of David, okay, not the Son of God. And the crowds that shouted, this is back to that Palm Sunday. Remember, I mentioned this before. They said, "Hosanna to the Son of David." So that was the idea that Jesus is going to be this military king. But something happened in the Sea of Galilee before this that began to really open their eyes. And what was that? Well, in Mark, this is described, when Jesus said, "Let's go to the other side," that would be the other side of the lake, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Rabbi, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Shalom." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Now, this is going to be something very different to them, and we'll see why. It's based on the scriptures. Because even these great heroes of the faith, like Elijah and Elisha, had done many miracles, including raising of the dead. But the Jewish belief is only God could control the sea, the abyss. Only God, that's it. It goes back to Job. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. After other miracles, they said, "Surely he is the Messiah." But after this one, they said, "Surely you are the Son of God," because what he had done by controlling the sea, going back to understanding the scriptures being fulfilled. All right, and then Jesus went on to say, "And I say you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, Peter was the Greek word Petros, which is a masculine word, which simply means a single rock or a stone. And on this rock is Petra, which is a feminine term, and it refers to a large immovable rock. So these are kind of like two different rock ideas, which we'll look at here. Peter, as a leader, and his disciples were to be given very important roles. But Jesus did not say to them or to Peter, "You are the rock, and on you I'm going to build my church." That's not what he said. He went on to say, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and wherever you bind," which means prohibit, on earth, "will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose," which means allow, on earth will be loosed in heaven. "I will give you the keys." This goes back to Isaiah. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." It's a remez or a reference back to that verse. So that's where that phrase is coming from. "And then I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David, and what he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." So he's given this extreme authority here because of this answer to Peter and the disciples. And of course, Peter, one of the first things he did was to approve the first Gentile being a convert after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And that happened here in this town we mentioned before, Caesarea on the seacoast. Cornelius, the centurion. "And I say that you, Peter, Petros, this rock, and on this rock I will build my church." And the next phrase, "the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Now, gates will not overcome it. What's going on here? Something's interesting, the way he worded this. Because city gates, and I mentioned them in terms of Sodom before, were cultural centers. That's where they made legal decisions, the news of the day, the markets. They paid taxes, proclamations of kings. All kinds of things happened here. Courts took place. But the main role of a gate is defense. Okay, that makes sense. They're to protect the city. So the role of the church is moving forward. The gates of Hades will not prevail. Interesting. So what is going on here? What is he saying? This is something very, very interesting. The gates of Hades will not overcome it. The pagan world versus the church. Who's prevailing? So in other words, the church is not to just lay back and let things happen. No, to move forward, to retake the gates of Hades is what Jesus is saying. This is an amazing message here. Sometimes I think this is lost today. This is so important at this teaching. We know from the scriptures it says your seed will inherit the gates of their enemies. Okay, and originally that was Abraham's descendants. But Paul expanded that. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. So in other words, if you belong to Christ, you are part of this, or we're all part of this group that is going to not allow the gates of Hades to prevail. Jesus is saying you have the authority to move ahead, and we're going to reclaim what has been taken away. And even the whole idea of the word church. The first mention of church in the Bible is just before the Passover, and it's this: tell the whole Adah of Israel. Now, Adah is the very first word for what become known as church, but back then it was translated as community. But what it really means is witness. Witnesses. It's from aid, which means witness. So the witnesses are really what is mentioned by the church, the army of witnesses. The church is not an isolated group, but it's an army of witnesses. In the New Testament, the word ecclesia is used, which is an assembly of citizens playing an active role. So our idea of church sometimes gets really confined and very, very small. And that's not really biblical. It's literally this army of witnesses, this assembly of citizens playing this very, very active role. So as the Adah of Jesus, we should not sit back and allow the gates of Hades to influence the world. To kind of summarize, that's what he's saying here. This is so important. An example from this past century of that not happening was Germany. In Germany, only 1/6 of the churches stood up to Hitler. The other 5/6 compromised their standards and did what Hitler wanted them to do to stay into existence. Along one of the train routes that was taking Jewish victims to the concentration camps to be killed sat a church that had a particular train going by, it seemed like every Sunday during their church service. And they could hear the cries of the victims inside of the train. Now, it was disturbing to the church members. So oftentimes what they would do is they would start singing so they couldn't hear the cries. And they would sing even louder to make sure they couldn't hear them. Now, that's amazing. It's incredible to think about that. But obviously, by the same token, for them to act would have been great consequences. But even still. Now, this man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was an example of somebody who did stand up to the gates of Hades. He said this: "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." And Dietrich gave his life for this. He gave his life standing up to Nazi Germany. Now, are we guilty by being silent? Well, in the book of Acts 22:20, it says, "And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there, giving my approval, and guarding the clothes of those who are killing him." Now, this is Paul. And this incident in his life, in which he was helping to kill Christians, later had a tremendous impact on his conversion. Another one: "If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." Now, during the Revolutionary War, in which the United States was facing incredible odds, trying to win a war against the greatest military power in the world, and we were nothing but a ragtag group of pioneers, not really an organized army at all, the churches played a major role. In fact, some of the churches were called the Black Regiment. Well, they stood up to England during the Revolutionary War. And what happened is during church services, actually, there were incidents where a pastor maybe had his uniform on underneath his robe, or the congregants brought their muskets to the church service, ready to fight, because they believed they were fighting for God's cause. They believed this new country was being formed by God, that He had purposes for this new country to be called the United States. And eventually, the British burned many of these churches to the ground. Now, obviously, by quoting this, I'm not saying that's what should be done in churches today. It's just an example from our history, a unique example. Now, one of the many examples of the gates of Hades, and of course that is the gates of Hades we're looking at right there, is a huge increase in child sex trafficking. This particular movie was created to create awareness of people to this big problem. And there were many who fought this movie being released, but this was direct attempt to fight the gates of Hades on this horrific crime. Now, think about it though. Was the gates of Hades in this mountain created pagan? Really? Well, after each day of creation, God said this, and God saw that it was good. Now, Satan owns absolutely nothing. All he can do is corrupt what God has made, and that's it. So the story begins in Genesis 1, not Genesis 3. The whole earth is full of His glory. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, so that men are without excuse. I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on His glorious throne. Now this is interesting, because Jesus is saying that one day everything will be renewed, not just us as believers in Him, but everything, all of his creation has been corrupted by Satan. He must remain in heaven until the time for God to restore everything, as he promised long ago through the holy prophets. That's very interesting. So what about this spring water fertility cults in the past? What about it? Is that really what it is? No. What is it? It's living water. The spring water represents God and his mercy and his grace, and they keep flowing. He said this to the Samaritan woman at the well, and we will look at that story. It's very interesting in the future. If you knew who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So it's living water, defined by Jesus himself. Now picture an angry, difficult to be around person you've met. That's probably easy to do. One who denounces you, constantly negative, always unhappy. What if we viewed that person the way Jesus does? A person God knit in their mother's womb, loved by God, with limitless potential. This idea of having a good eye, Ein Tova, that would be what Jesus wants us to do on how God created them and us. Now, at the conclusion of Jesus' teaching, this happened. Then he said to them all, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his very self? Then probably turning to just his disciples, he said, if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in the adulterous and sinful generation, now remember, they're right in front of all this pagan stuff going on right in front of them, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with holy angels. Now, ultimately, who is the rock? Well, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. And of course, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. And Peter also said, he is the stone the builders rejected, which has become the capstone. Salvation is found in no other name. And that was the area, Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. So on the cross, where Jesus suffered this barbaric and brutal Roman crucifixion, he defeated the gates of Hades because he didn't stay there. He rose from the dead and he conquered the gates of Hades. And it's just amazing. It's what gives us life. Why did the early church explode in growth? Because these young disciples lived out their rabbi's teachings. They went into a world that was very difficult, a world in which the emperors are declaring themselves to be God, and they were trying to force people to worship them, or there was great consequences, in many cases death. In spite of all of that and all this massive persecution, the word spread. Asia Minor was a much larger version of what they had witnessed when they stood in Ephesus, Pergamon, Laodicea, Sardis, and Thyatira. They fully understood why Jesus took them to Caesarea Philippi that day. In 100 years, these pagan cities became filled with followers of Jesus. And here's an amazing map. 100 years later, this is a map of Christianity, how far it had already spread within that time period. With the exception of John, all the rest of the disciples were eventually martyred for their faith. And church tradition gives us an idea of where that happened for each of them. If we look at this map, we can see how far out it was actually. Thomas way on the far right in India, to Peter on the far left in Italy, and all these other disciples in between gave their life for the cause. And boy, did this message spread. The only exception, as I mentioned, was John, and he lived out his life on the island of Patmos, and he wrote the book of Revelation. Now, as Jesus did with his young disciples, he is calling each of us to join his bold rock movement. Thank you for watching this presentation of Upon This Rock. And I think it's so important because this was such an important teaching of Jesus for his disciples, teaching them that the gates of Hades would not prevail. But obviously he's teaching us too today to have this boldness through him, through his power, through his conquering the gates of Hades, that we could go on and live our lives in a way that we honor him too. So my wish for you is shalom.